They said the war was over, but down the hospital halls, the screaming never stopped. Men shook uncontrollably,
Incoming!
clawed
Take
at their
cover!
faces, and whispered to ghosts no one else could see.
Help me, I can't
Some
see.
went blind overnight, without a mark on them. Others forgot how to speak. Their lungs were clear. Their hearts were strong. But something inside had snapped. Doctors called it shell shock. The army called it weakness.
Weakness.
And the world tried to forget. Tonight, we're not walking through trenches or battlefields. We're stepping
Weakness.
inside the human mind, a place more terrifying than any weapon ever built. Where the guns went silent, but the minds did not. If the hidden truths of war and the minds it shattered keep you curious, hit like and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me what time is it where you are and where in the world you're listening from. Imagine, for a moment, the year is 1915. You stand on the docks, watching the ships return, laden not just with weary bodies, but with untold stories. As the gangplanks lower, you see them, the soldiers, your neighbors, your brothers, stepping onto solid ground once more. Relief should flood your senses, a deep, calming wave of gratitude. But something is wrong. You look into their eyes, and what you find there is not the expected joy of homecoming. It's a vacant stare, a window to a place you cannot comprehend. There are no bandages on their heads, no missing limbs, no visible scars. Yet, their bodies tell a different tale. You watch as a young man, barely out of his teens, stumbles forward, his hands trembling so violently he cannot hold a cup of tea. His eyes dart around, scanning the peaceful dock as if expecting an explosion at any moment. Another stands perfectly still, a statue amidst the bustle, his lips moving soundlessly, no words escaping. You try to speak to him, to offer a comforting hand, but his gaze remains fixed on some unseen horizon, his mind miles away, perhaps still amidst the mud and fire. You hear whispers from the medical orderlies. He's blind, they say. Blind as a bat, but the doctors can't find a thing wrong with his eyes. Others can't speak. A sudden, inexplicable mutism seizing their voices, though their throats are clear and strong. Their bodies, to all outward appearances, are whole. But something fundamental, something deep within their very being, has fractured. It was in this eerie atmosphere, as these invisible wounds multiplied, that a man named Dr. Charles Myers stepped forward. You can almost feel the weight of his contemplation as he observed these broken men. In 1915, he gave this terrifying phenomenon a name, a label to capture the unseen enemy, shell shock. It was an attempt to categorize the confusion, the paralysis, the emotional collapse that was spreading like wildfire through the ranks. You might feel a chill at the thought of it, this unseen affliction, claiming men not with bullets or shrapnel, but with a profound, internal disintegration. The military authorities, however, felt a different kind of chill. You can sense their fear, a cold, strategic apprehension. They worried this shock could become contagious, that the sight of men breaking down might demoralize entire divisions, crippling their fighting force from within. So, in the hushed corridors of power, a decision was made. You might imagine the solemn faces, the quiet discussions, as early hospital files detailing these cases were sealed away, or even destroyed. The aim was clear: prevent public panic, maintain morale, and deny the truth of this psychological warfare. The British War Office, with an almost chilling detachment, officially dismissed any psychological cause, labeling these profound breakdowns as mere fatigue, a simple word for a shattering reality. But as you consider this, a deeper, more unsettling question begins to form in your mind. Could this epidemic of invisible wounds have been more than just a consequence of terror? Could it reveal the very first evidence of psychological contagion? That fear, when wielded with such intensity, in such an overwhelming environment, could become a biological weapon of war, designed to break the human spirit before a single shot was even fired. The thought lingers, quiet and unsettling, as the fog of denial settles over the truth. Let's transport ourselves now, away from the quiet docks and into a different landscape entirely. The trenches. You are there, standing on earth that is less ground and more a churning, viscous soup of mud, human waste, and the lingering scent of decay. Around you, the air is thick with the smell of damp earth, cordite, and something metallic, something you instinctively know is blood. For months, you have lived in this land of impossibility, a labyrinth of dugouts and barbed wire that becomes not just a physical prison, but a profound psychological trap. You gaze out over the parapet, if you dare, into a wasteland sculpted by constant shelling. The ground before you is not merely disturbed earth. It is a graveyard, a jumble of shattered trees and unseen corpses, often half buried, half exposed, the silent sentinels of a war that consumes everything. Rats, bold and relentless, scuttle across the duckboards, their eyes glinting in the gloom, constant companions in this bleak existence. And the shelling, you feel it deep in your bones, a constant, concussive tremor that never truly leaves you. The ground beneath your feet vibrates with unseen explosions, a relentless, grinding pressure that slowly, imperceptibly, erodes every layer of your sanity. As the days blur into weeks, and weeks into months, something begins to shift within your mind. The line between reality and hallucination blurs. You hear voices in the cacophony of the battlefield, whispers carried on the wind that sound like forgotten friends, or perhaps something far more sinister. You stare into the vacant eyes of a fallen comrade, a face frozen in a final moment of terror, and for a fleeting, horrifying second, you believe you see movement, a flicker of awareness. You find yourself whispering to the mud, to the rats, to the very air, sharing secrets with the earth that no living soul should ever hear. The constant exposure to the noise, the filth, the terror, it's a crucible that melts away the edges of who you are, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve. Your officers, you notice, watch you and your comrades with a detached intensity. They speak in hushed tones, noting how panic, a sudden, visceral wave of pure terror, can spread through an entire platoon within minutes, an invisible current carrying men away from their senses. You hear murmurs, whispered from one weary soldier to another, about field stress tests, rumors that military doctors aren't just treating the wounded, but observing the fear responses of men in battle, charting the precise moments of their psychological collapse. And then there are the experimental sedatives. You recall the dull, heavy feeling in your limbs, the slight haze in your mind, after being given a small vial of liquid before a major offensive. A doctor, his face impassive, assures you it will calm your nerves. You take it, because what choice do you have? You want to believe it helps, but a part of you wonders what exactly is coursing through your veins, what unspoken purpose it truly serves. This leads you to a chilling realization, a hidden insight that settles deep in your heart like a cold stone. Were these early combat stress studies merely what they seemed? An attempt to understand the human breaking point, or were they, in fact, covert human experiments, designed not just to observe, but to actively participate in the breaking and rebuilding of the human mind, to see how much a man could endure before shattering, and how he might be pieced back together, perhaps in a new, more compliant form? The thought is unsettling, a quiet terror that echoes the shelling, long after the sound has faded. Now, let us return to the slightly less chaotic, yet equally intense world of Dr. Charles Myers. Imagine yourself in his study, the air thick with the scent of old paper and medical texts. A quiet space where the horrors of the front lines are dissected and understood, not with scalpels, but with intellect. You can almost feel the weight of his convictions as he meticulously compiles his findings. He reaches a profound, yet deeply unsettling conclusion: shell shock. This invisible wound is not physical in origin. It is psychological, a desperate, fundamental defense mechanism of the brain, a means by which the mind tries to escape an unbearable reality. You can sense the friction this discovery created, a palpable tension in the medical establishment. His superiors, men of rigid military doctrine, demand that he meticulously remove any reference to mental collapse from his reports. The very phrase itself, they believe, is too dangerous, too destabilizing. You might imagine the quiet but firm pressure exerted on him, the gentle suggestions that become increasingly forceful directives. There are whispers, too, that for a brief period, he was even removed from duty, ostensibly for security reasons. The implication hangs heavy in the air, that the truth, in wartime, is a weapon that must be carefully controlled. The Army medical bulletins, meticulously crafted for public consumption, begin to redefine shell shock. You read their sterile language, observing how the profound disintegration of a human mind is calmly repackaged as temporary nervous exhaustion. It sounds so benign, so treatable, so far removed from the raw, shaking reality you witnessed on the docks. Behind these official pronouncements, however, a quiet, intense debate rages among neurologists. You can almost hear their hushed, intellectual arguments. Can fear, pure, unadulterated terror, truly cause measurable, physical damage to the brain? Is the mind, then, not just a vessel for thought, but a fragile organ that can be literally broken by experience? And then, years later, you stumble upon something else. Letters, faded with time, begin to surface. They imply that Dr. Myers's original, uncensored notes, his deepest insights into the psychological ravages of war, were quickly classified under wartime secrecy laws. You can almost feel the deliberate hand of censorship, the quiet erasure of inconvenient truths. His insights, born of compassion and scientific inquiry, were deemed too sensitive, too revealing of the true cost of industrial warfare. This brings you to a quiet, yet profound, hidden insight. Was the discovery of shell shock and the subsequent attempts to suppress its true nature less about protecting the soldiers and more about protecting the system? Was it suppressed, not because it was misunderstood, but precisely because it exposed a terrifying truth that industrial warfare, with its relentless noise, its unimaginable scale of violence, and its sheer psychological terror, literally rewires the human brain. That the very act of surviving such a conflict fundamentally changes who you are, down to the deepest neural pathways. The thought is both terrifying and liberating, revealing a truth that transcends the battlefield and touches the very core of human resilience and vulnerability. Close your eyes now, and let the quiet hum of the present fade, replaced by a deep, resonant rumble that vibrates through the earth itself. You are there, standing on the edge of a vast, broken landscape in the summer of 1916. This is the Somme. You can almost taste the dust and the metallic tang of exploded shells in the air. This battle, more than any other, carved an indelible scar into the collective memory of humanity, not just for the unprecedented number of physical casualties, but for the profound, almost unimaginable, psychological toll it exacted. You witness the unimaginable. 20,000 men die on the first day alone, their lives extinguished in a single, brutal morning. But as the days stretch into weeks, and the weeks into months, you begin to understand that thousands more kept dying, not in their bodies, but in the silent, hidden chambers of their minds. The reports filtering back from the front are chilling, depicting a landscape of broken bodies and even more broken spirits. An estimated 35,000 soldiers suffer mental breakdowns during this single campaign. You might try to envision such a number, a small city of men, each consumed by an internal battle more fearsome than any enemy trench. You walk through the makeshift aid stations, the field hospitals, and what you see there is etched into your memory. Soldiers, young and old, shake uncontrollably, their bodies racked by a tremor that no amount of warmth or rest can soothe. You watch men who, just weeks ago, were laughing and joking, now laugh hysterically, an unnatural, high-pitched sound that carries no joy, only a terrifying despair. Others sit in profound silence, their faces blank, their eyes distant, having gone mute, unable to form a single word to describe the horrors they've endured. The military hospitals, already stretched beyond their limits by physical injuries, overflow with these men who cannot speak, cannot stop trembling, cannot reconnect with the world around them. In their hastily scribbled diaries, recovered years later, you read fragments that speak to the universal experience of this mental collapse. Fear became a language everyone understood. One entry states, a stark testament to the shared, pervasive terror that permeated every moment. Another describes how the brain simply ceased to function in any rational way. A profound surrender of the self to the overwhelming weight of the conflict. You see these hospitals, once dedicated to mending bones and patching flesh, now subtly repurposed. They are becoming mental wards, though officially, they are still labeled as mere rest centers, a quiet renaming, a softening of the truth, to avoid confronting the sheer scale of the psychological devastation. And as you stand there, surveying this landscape of both physical and mental wreckage, a profound, hidden insight begins to settle upon you. What if the Somme was not merely a slaughter of bodies, a grim testament to the destructive power of modern weaponry? What if it was something far more profound, far more terrifying? What if the Battle of the Somme was, in essence, the world's first mass collapse of the collective human mind? A moment when the very fabric of human sanity, stretched beyond its breaking point, began to unravel on an unprecedented scale. The thought is chilling, reminding you that war's deepest scars are often those you can never truly see. Now, shift your gaze, gently, from the muddy fields of the Somme to the stark, clinical environment of a military hospital far behind the lines. You are in a ward, perhaps in a quiet corner, observing the unfolding drama. Here, in the search for a cure for shell shock, some doctors turn to a method that, even today, feels profoundly unsettling: Faradism. You watch as a physician, his face etched with a strange blend of determination and desperation, prepares a crude device. Wires are attached, pads placed on the soldier's skin, often across his throat if he is mute, or on his limbs if they are paralyzed. You hear the quiet hum of the apparatus, a low, unsettling sound. Then, with a flick of a switch, a surge of electricity courses through the man's body. A scream, raw and involuntary, tears from his throat. His paralyzed limbs convulse, or his mute mouth opens, forced into utterance by the sheer shock. Within minutes, often less, he is declared cured. He can speak again, or move his arm. The doctor notes the success, and you see the weary relief in the eyes of the staff. But then, almost immediately, the cured soldier is ready to be sent back to the combat zone. His underlying trauma untouched, only his symptoms forcibly suppressed. You might feel a deep, uncomfortable ache in your chest watching this, a sense of profound injustice. You learn that this wasn't an isolated practice. Across the battle lines, in French and German hospitals, psychiatrists, under intense military pressure, were developing similar shock therapies. The atmosphere in some of these wards, you realize, must have resembled laboratories more than places of healing. The focus wasn't truly on the complex, nuanced restoration of a shattered mind. No, the goal had subtly, but profoundly, shifted. It was no longer about healing in the conventional sense. Instead, it became about measuring endurance, about forcing obedience, about finding the precise point at which pain could override psychological collapse and return a man to function. Regardless of the internal cost, it felt, to your sensitive spirit, like a form of sanctioned torture. And then, you uncover something even more unsettling. Surviving documents, carefully pieced together from fragmented archives, hint at a deeper, more calculated purpose. They suggest a quiet collaboration between neurologists, the very experts who understood the intricate workings of the brain, and Army intelligence. You imagine hushed meetings, charts and diagrams spread across a table, not just discussing symptoms, but exploring the mechanisms of control, the points of vulnerability. This leads you to a chilling, hidden insight, one that whispers through the quiet halls of history. Were these so-called treatments merely desperate attempts to mend broken men? Were they, in a far more sinister sense, the very first government-approved experiments in psychological control? Tests to see how much a human being could be manipulated, coerced, or shocked back into obedience, even against the deepest protests of their own shattered mind. The answer, you sense, is a complex and troubling one, blurring the lines between healing and control, between science and coercion, leaving a lasting shadow on the nascent field of mental health. Now, let your mind gently turn towards a different path, a flicker of light in the dim, desperate search for healing. You move from the harsh, sterile environment of the shock wards to a quieter, more contemplative space, a place where the unspoken horrors of war are finally given a voice. Here, you encounter the pioneering work of Dr. W.H.R. Rivers. Imagine him, a calm, attentive presence, listening intently, his gaze compassionate yet firm. He champions a revolutionary idea for the time, a radical departure from the electric shocks, the talking cure. You are present in a therapy session, sitting quietly in a corner, as a soldier, his face etched with unspeakable pain, slowly begins to speak. Dr. Rivers encourages him, gently guiding him to confront his trauma, to re-experience the nightmares not in isolation, but in the safe, structured space of dialogue. You witness the raw power of this process. Patients re-experience profound guilt, their faces contorted as they recall impossible choices made under duress. They describe hallucinations, the ghosts of the battlefield still lingering in their peripheral vision, and sudden, debilitating waves of panic that grip them without warning. But through the agonizing process of articulation, of putting words to the unspeakable, they slowly begin to recover partial control, to reclaim fragments of their shattered selves. You listen to one particularly harrowing account. A soldier, tears streaming down his face, admits to shooting a wounded comrade by mistake in the chaos of battle. A desperate act of mercy, or perhaps a terror-induced error. He confesses that he hears that comrade's voice every single night, a tormenting echo in the silence of his room. Dr. Rivers listens, his presence a steady anchor, allowing the man to unpack the immense burden of his guilt. This quiet revolution finds a home at Craig Lockhart Hospital, a place that becomes both a sanctuary for these broken men and, you sense, a site of quiet surveillance. Here, poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon find their voices, transforming their experiences into verse, immortalizing the suffering. But even in this haven, rumors persist. You hear whispers that therapy sessions, these intimate revelations of the human soul, were secretly recorded, not for the benefit of the patients, but for a chillingly detached purpose, psychological warfare research. The idea that one's deepest fears and vulnerabilities could be cataloged and analyzed for military advantage sends a shiver down your spine. It is here, in these quiet yet profound conversations, that the concept of post-traumatic memory truly emerges. The understanding that trauma, especially of this magnitude, never truly ends. It doesn't fade with time. It weaves itself into the very fabric of memory, living on as a perpetual echo. And as you reflect on this, a profound, hidden insight begins to surface. Did the birth of modern therapy, this compassionate effort to heal the invisible wounds of war, also mark a darker discovery for the military? Did they realize, through these very sessions, how to truly weaponize the human mind, not just by breaking it with terror, but by understanding its vulnerabilities, its triggers, its deepest fears, and perhaps how to exploit them in future conflicts? The thought is unsettling, suggesting that even in the act of healing, the seeds of future control were quietly being sown. Now, let the journey carry you to a moment of profound and chilling injustice that stands as a testament to the military's harsh intolerance for what it perceived as weakness. You are transported to a desolate morning, the air crisp and cold, on the Western Front. Here, You witness the story of Private Harry Farr. He was not an untested recruit. He was a decorated soldier, a man who had faced the inferno of battle countless times. But as you watch, you see him break down. The war, the ceaseless terror, the unyielding pressure finally became too much. He refused to return to the front, his mind, shattered by shell shock, could take no more. You might imagine the frantic pleas of his comrades, perhaps even the quiet concern of some officers who had seen the same affliction claim other men. But in the rigid, unforgiving structure of wartime command, there was no room for such nuance. Despite medical records that clearly documented his psychological collapse, despite the visible tremors and the vacant stare you've come to recognize, Harry Farr was court-martialed. The charge cowardice. You stand by as his trial unfolds. A swift and brutal affair. It lasts a mere 20 minutes. A blink of an eye for a man's life to be weighed and judged. The verdict is predetermined. The outcome inescapable. And then, he is executed. Shot by firing squad for refusing to fight. For a breakdown that was beyond his control. His family, waiting anxiously at home, receives only a sterile notice of his death, devoid of detail, devoid of the agonizing truth. You feel the profound injustice, a cold, hard knot in your stomach. And Harry Farr was not alone. You learn, with a growing sense of horror, that over 300 similar executions occurred across British and French forces throughout the war. Men deemed cowards for succumbing to the invisible wounds of shell shock were summarily put to death. You can almost hear the voices of the commanders. Their arguments cold and pragmatic. They feared that recognizing shell shock as a legitimate illness, as a genuine psychological injury, would open the floodgates. It would, they believed, justify mass refusal to fight, shattering morale and collapsing the entire war effort. Discipline, in their eyes, was paramount, even if it meant sacrificing the lives of men already profoundly broken. Decades later, long after the cannons fell silent and the world tried to forget, you witness the painstaking work of families, driven by an unwavering love and a desperate need for truth. They painstakingly uncover suppressed documents, dusty and forgotten in government archives. These papers, once hidden from public view, finally prove what they had always known in their hearts. These men were not disloyal, not cowards. They were profoundly, tragically ill. Victims of a war that destroyed not just bodies, but minds. And as you reflect on this dark chapter, a profound, hidden insight settles within you. Were these executions truly about maintaining moral discipline, about punishing cowardice? Or were they, in a far more chilling sense, a calculated effort, a desperate, brutal measure to hide a psychological epidemic that threatened to expose the true, devastating cost of the war? A silent, unseen collapse within the ranks that could undermine the very narrative of courage and sacrifice. The quiet horror of this realization resonates deeply, a mournful echo through the halls of history. Allow your thoughts to now gently turn to the very foundations of modern psychology. A field born, in many ways, from the crucible of this terrible war. You are transported to the quiet, yet intensely intellectual, circles where some of the greatest minds of the era, Rivers, Myers, Freud, and Charcot, shaped our early understanding of the human psyche. You can almost feel the energy of their debates, the quiet intensity of their observations as they grappled with the profound breakdown of the human mind they witnessed in the soldiers. They laid the groundwork for psychological medicine, attempting to map the uncharted territories of trauma and neurosis. But as their groundbreaking findings began to emerge, something else, something less compassionate, was happening. You sense the shift, a subtle but significant absorption of their insights by military intelligence agencies. Their studies, intended to heal, were now being scrutinized for their potential application in understanding morale, in developing interrogation techniques, in finding ways to make men more resilient or, conversely, more susceptible to suggestion. The delicate art of therapy, born of empathy, was being reimagined as a tool for strategic advantage. You observe how recovery for many soldiers, especially those exhibiting the most severe forms of shell shock, took on a chillingly pragmatic definition. It often meant less about true emotional healing and more about retraining men to obey without question, to function in society without drawing undue attention to their internal battles. You might imagine the quiet re-education programs, the subtle conditioning, designed to restore not just health, but compliance. The goal was often to make them fit for purpose again, whether that purpose was civilian life or, terrifyingly, a return to the front. Further delving into the past, you discover documents, quietly declassified much later, revealing state funding for neural conditioning programs by as early as 1918. You can almost visualize the clandestine laboratories, the precise experiments aimed at understanding how the brain could be rewired, how behaviors could be altered. In Germany, in a chilling echo of these programs, special villages were established. Here, shell shock victims were employed in therapeutic labor, ostensibly for their own good, but always under the watchful eye of surveillance. They were observed, their reactions meticulously recorded, their very lives becoming data points in a larger, darker study. And as you contemplate this complex intersection of healing and control, a profound, hidden insight begins to settle within your thoughts. Was modern psychology, with its immense capacity for compassion and understanding, truly born solely from a desire to heal the wounded mind? Or was it, in a more uncomfortable truth, also deeply shaped by war's insatiable need to understand, and ultimately to make men unbreakable, to create soldiers who could endure psychological torment without fracturing, or to manipulate the minds of adversaries? The thought is unsettling, suggesting that even our deepest explorations of the human condition can be intertwined with the darker impulses of conflict, blurring the lines between solace and subjugation. Now, let your mind drift to the quiet, almost ethereal moment when the guns finally fell silent. It is November 11th, 1918. The armistice has been signed. A profound, collective sigh of relief sweeps across the world. You witness the celebrations, the joy, the belief that peace has finally arrived. But as the parades pass and the initial jubilation fades, you realize that for tens of thousands of men, the screaming had not stopped. For them, the war continued to rage, not on distant battlefields, but within the confines of their own shattered minds. You are a silent observer in the homes across America and Europe, witnessing the private struggles, families, overjoyed to have their husbands, fathers, and sons back, soon face a new, agonizing reality. They report waking in the dead of night to the sound of their loved ones shouting, clawing at invisible enemies in their sleep, reliving the horrors that no one else could see. You feel the anguish of these families, caught between their love and their profound inability to bridge the chasm that separated them from the men they once knew. As the world turned its attention to rebuilding and forgetting, a more sinister process began in the quiet archives of government. You imagine the hushed directives, the meticulous erasure. Government records were quietly altered. Shell shock cases systematically removed from official war statistics. It was as if, by removing the name, they could make the suffering disappear. Medical officers, in their official reports, began to write that recovery is measured by silence, a chilling phrase implying that the ideal outcome was not healing, but the suppression of any visible or audible symptom, a quiet descent into oblivion. By 1921, just 3 years after the armistice, you learn with a heavy heart that thousands upon thousands of these men remained institutionalized, locked away in asylums, their minds forever trapped in the trenches, and thousands more simply vanished, lost to society, unable to cope, their fates unknown. The public narrative, meanwhile, was carefully sculpted. It glorified heroism, celebrated victory, and honored sacrifice. The broken minds, the ones who bore the deepest, most invisible scars, were quietly ushered into the shadows, their stories fading into secrecy, inconvenient truths tucked away to preserve the illusion of triumph. And as you reflect on this deliberate act of historical revision, a profound, hidden insight begins to form in your mind. Did post-war governments, eager to cement the narrative of a glorious victory, deliberately erase shell-shock victims from the official record? Was it to preserve the myth of courage, of unwavering strength, and to avoid acknowledging the devastating psychological cost of a conflict that had been hailed as the war to end all wars? The thought lingers, a quiet testament to the enduring human tendency to prioritize narrative over truth, especially when that truth is painful and inconvenient. And so, we arrive at the present, our journey through the echoes of the past bringing us full circle. You stand here now, looking back at the long shadow cast by shell shock, realizing that it became more than just a medical term for a specific affliction of World War I. It became a powerful metaphor for an entire century, proof that memory itself, when steeped in trauma, can wound just as deeply as any bullet or bomb. The very idea that the mind could break under psychological pressure, rather than just physical harm, resonated through every conflict that followed. You observe how later regimes, far removed from the muddy trenches of the Great War, meticulously studied wartime trauma, not for healing, but to develop sophisticated propaganda techniques, to understand how to break the will of a populace, and to refine interrogation methods. The insights gleaned from the suffering of shell-shock victims became a dark blueprint. The insidious idea of mental warfare began to emerge. The concept that morale could be shattered, that an enemy could be conquered without firing a single shot, simply by targeting the human mind. You delve into documents from the 1930s and 1940s, quietly declassified many years later, and find chilling hints of continued human trials, experiments, building upon the early, crude attempts at psychological control, designed to push the boundaries of mental endurance and breakdown. These were not just theoretical exercises. They were active explorations into the fragility and malleability of the human spirit under extreme duress. Shell shock, as a diagnosis, evolved. It transformed across decades and conflicts, into what we now recognize as modern post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Yet, even with all our advancements in neuroscience and psychology, you realize that our understanding remains profoundly incomplete. The ghosts of the past, the men who shook uncontrollably and whispered to unseen horrors, are still with us, manifesting in different forms, under different names. The symptoms may be reclassified, the treatments more humane, but the fundamental struggle remains. The story, you recognize, doesn't end in peace. It concludes not with a quiet resolution, but with the perpetual echoes of war reverberating within the intricate, vulnerable landscape of the human mind. The battlefields may fall silent, but the internal wars, for countless individuals, continue to rage, generation after generation. And as you let this profound realization settle within you, a final, hidden insight emerges, powerful and unsettling. What if the true, enduring legacy of World War I was not merely the trenches, the new weapons, or the redrawing of maps? What if its most significant, most terrifying discovery was this, that the human mind, in all its complexity and resilience, can be conquered, broken, and even reshaped as easily as nations? That the deepest battlefield of all lies not in the physical world, but within the silent, unseen depths of our own consciousness. This understanding, you sense, is a burden we continue to carry, a silent truth echoing through the calm and quiet of our own minds, long after the last gun has fired.